Bonjour tout le monde, good morning. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin peoples where this conference is taking part, and also my embarrassment really around speaking in front of you all when there's so many of you far more experienced and doing amazing work. What I'm hopefully going to do today is bring to you some ideas and thinking around the restorative city concept and the way that's developed in the UK. But actually also, I'd like to respectfully challenge our role as professionals and practitioners and the impact we have or are not having on the people who are outside of this building at the moment, not in this conference. So I do so with great respect, but as this is our time, is an interesting byline, and it's, as far as I can see, it's been our time now for the 10, 12 years I've been involved in doing this work. And I think it's about time we actually made it our time properly and not constantly keep meeting again to talk about moving things forward. So just a little introduction to who I am. I'm from Hull in England. Yesterday I went in search of the Ilder Hull in across the river and couldn't find it. You know, we were very big for a long time in England, really, of naming everywhere in the world, so we can always look at it as a little bit of our home. But I'm from Hull in the north of England, where the red dot is there. And interestingly, and this is some work I'd really like to do at one time, it's a seaport. It had a trawler industry, and it had an incredibly restorative community before we even knew there was a word for restorative communities. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of some of the settings where this work really takes off quickly. And I'm reflecting on the work we've done and shared with Halifax in Nova Scotia, a very similar sort of environment in terms of the community that's developed there. So Hull's in the north of England, and I'm a Yorkshireman rather than an Englishman, and that's quite important to say because we have got our own way of doing things. And in Hull, we're the City of Culture this year, which was a big surprise to everybody, not least those of us from Hull. And the best-selling T-shirt in Hull the day it was announced was that T-shirt. And I think it shows that we were restorative because we had a real sense of our compass of shame right from the start. And we attack self better than anybody else in the world. And what's interesting is that was on the announcement of us getting the City of Culture. It was probably a year and a half before. That shirt would not sell now because Hull has found its own voice and found its own culture and reminded itself, as Haley has just done, that this is about people and it's about our people and the people we are with. And that's really what restorative justice, restorative practice is for me. And I'll make the distinction between the justice and the practice as we move through this presentation. What I think is important, and this is to echo the work that Haley said, is that Maori proverb. Okay? It says, this is about people, the people, the people. And I respectfully would suggest it's not saying it's about us. We are just part of the people. Okay? And we have to be really careful about the way as professionals and practitioners we engage with ourselves and also those we work with. And I think that's one of the thoughts I'd like you to take today, because there isn't, as I see it at the moment, a definition of a restorative city or restorative organisation really that's consistent. And when I use the term city, it could be province, it could be town, it could be a large organisation. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it's important to say that the absence of being called a restorative city does not mean that within that city or that place, restorative things happen. People care for each other, communities come together. And I think that there is a risk around definition which we have to really think about carefully. And this is a sort of story of that development from Hull's perspective. The other thing about restorative cities are it's a little bit like buying a new door. I didn't know I needed a new door until my wife came home one day and said, Tony and Deborah have got new doors. And it became instantly clear to me I needed a new door. What was wrong with the old door, as in the old system around that you're using around the way you work now, I couldn't quite work out. But clearly, the new door thing was going to work for us. And it was important that we had one quickly, because other people were getting them faster than we were. And, you know, if you don't move quickly enough, suddenly you're right at the back of the train. But there is a risk around why people want things. Okay, so why do so many cities in the UK want to badge themselves as restorative cities? Okay, because badges are easy to put on, but they're much, much more difficult to define in terms of behaviours and language. And those are the two things I think that we need to keep coming back to. How is this a restorative environment? And it's too complex to go into some academic diatribe about that. But let's just think about it as language and behaviours. Because the people we work with, and the people we work with in this room, and the people we work with that are out there, the families, need to understand the language we're using. And this quote from Kay Pranis, I think, is also very, very important, because I'd like to suggest, well, I'm not like to suggest, I am going to suggest that restorative practice is an incredibly democratic process. And in a world which we find at the moment to be imbued with a tendency towards division and divisiveness, the development of restorative communities, the development of restorative language in young people and families, not just in the organisations we work for, is absolutely vital. Because if voting is anything, it's at the end of a process. Putting the cross on the ballot paper is not democracy. The conversation that happened up to that point is democratic. And we have to empower and revive the process of dialogue within our own organisations and with our communities we work with. I mean, the other thing as well about this is that it's very easy to stand on a stage and make a story up which seems very seamless, that it started there and it always was working towards a perfection, which is where we are today. Okay. What I do know is that that great restorative practitioner Bob Seger got it just about right. Okay, is that it's much easier sometimes to forget the things you got wrong and the things you didn't know at the start, because we didn't in Hull set out with a vision, though that I've got a slide I'll show you in a second that suggests that we did, that we would end up where we ended up 3 or 4 years later. Okay, and that was replicated in other towns and cities in the UK. Okay, if it was only that simple, it would be great. You know, we stumbled into the idea of restorative working from desperation on some of our parts, working with very, very, very complex, very, very challenging families and young people. And the punitive model we were using was not working. We had to find another way of doing it. And it became restorative practice. I think the other thing to say as well is this isn't Lord of the Rings. An eagle's not going to pop up and save everybody just when things look tricky. Okay? The thing with the Lord of the Rings, when you use that device of an eagle, is that, you know, why write 1,000 pages when you can just get the bloody eagle to take them from the start and just fly in? So the difficulty with our roles sometimes is we can be seen as eagles. People who commission your services want you to fly in and rescue. The whole rescue gene in public service is something we have to challenge, because it is taking away the responsibility from the families that exist in our restorative cities. And I use the word family in all sorts of varied contexts here, because it's from the families that we have our strengths. It's also from the families our victims and perpetrators come from. So the family is going to be seen, in terms of restorative cities, at the heart of what we're doing. And just for simplicity, there is this definition around the distinction I'm making. Okay. Restorative justice, which is the title of this conference, I see as it's a reactive process. It's a process. It happens at the end. Something's broken. To create a restorative city, we develop restorative practice, of which restorative justice is an element. And that distinction, I think, is very, very important. Because I work for an organisation that takes a grant from the Ministry of Justice and is fighting desperately to separate itself from the criminal justice definition to be seen as a practice definition, working in all sorts of different areas, in all sorts of different environments. And I think that's what a restorative city looks to do. And so, what are people in the UK saying? Well, a piece of academic research recently, after interviewing a large number of us, came up with this opening statement. And it's not true. I'd like to think I woke up one morning and had an emancipatory vision, but I didn't. And neither did the other people with us. But when people can reflect back on that, it does look like that's what we wanted to do. We eventually got there, but my use of restorative justice was in a school which was described by our inspectorate when I was asked to go into it in 2004 as the worst school in the United Kingdom. And quite probably it was. It was dysfunctional at every level. Staff didn't get on with each other. Kids didn't get on with each other. Kids and staff didn't get on with each other. And it was almost, for me, the last resort. It wasn't about emancipation. It was like, can I stop excluding these kids in this punitive way and finding a different way? But I think we developed that theory as we came together as a group of school heads, as we developed through a training model that we used in the city, as we developed it across children's services, in social care, in children's homes. And for a period of 3 or 4 years, I actually think we were moving in that direction. The momentum for that wasn't maintained, as these things often are. Lots of things happened, not least of all the austerity that we all suddenly became affected by. But it was, I think, at its height, a key vision around we want to emancipate. Other cities in the UK use these descriptions of themselves. Bristol wanting to be setting the benchmark for others to use. I'm not sure that this is a competition. Look at us, we've got a really big, shiny restorative hat on. You can have one too. And I think that's a concern. I think that Norfolk, which is a huge county in England, very rural, with also some areas of urban deprivation, I think it's started to move in the right direction. Starting to see this not just being about conflict, but it's also about building and maintaining relationships and giving people a vocabulary. And then Wokingham, where there's a really, really inspiring director of children's services, is very, very, not cynical, sceptical about restorative justice. And I think that's optimistic skepticism is really, really quite important, because he sees the tie to that definition around restorative justice as being a barrier as much as it's a support of it. And he actually doesn't think he needs to badge his authority with being restorative city, but what he needs to do is aspire to be such a thing. And then the way he works with his teams, and his teams work with families, and families are empowered to work, is the way he sees things moving forward. What I'm going to say in terms of how to develop restorative organisations is there's one or two sort of little quotes I'd like to use. I am absolutely convinced that we cannot drive this from the centre. It cannot be government driven. It has to have government involvement. If it is entirely government driven, or it is entirely local government driven, or entirely professionally driven, it will in itself crack. It will implode under its own, under the tensions and the gravities it creates, and it will not achieve the things it needs to achieve. There's got to be a co-creation of this around the people who are not in this room. Okay? We all spend a lot of time talking in these spaces, and it's about how we turn this space and the energy in this space into the work we do outside. Because you all go back to work on Wednesday, or some of you do, and the real risk is the excitement of being here for 2 days disappears or drowns under the weight of your new responsibilities or the things that have happened while you've been away. So it's how we plan for that, and we'll look at a model for that as we're developing. There also the issue around change is really, really important. Okay? As you change things, the understanding within an organisation gets very sad. It gets almost like depressed. Because even if people don't like working in the place they're working, they like that a damn sight more than some restorative stuff somebody's going to come and make them do. Unless you've convinced them. And the whole idea behind fair process, obviously, is all around that. but we do hold on to things. And so the risk with restorative practice and restorative justice is we just layer it on top of what's already there. And it's like a Jenga tower. We just keep layering things on top of it themselves. And in the end, the thing falls and we take a step back and we're disappointed by that. So we have to not layer things on top of each other. We have to start looking at the way in which we can embed and implement restorative, thread it through the systems that already exist. Because those systems are so complex, we can't replace them quickly. And so the restorative process needs to be finding its way to exist within some very hostile environments. And the key for me to this is who's not here. The people who we need to talk to, the people who we need to draw our power from. Because one rule applies here. There are more people out there than there are in this room. And we need to find better and more effective ways of engaging those people. And those people represent organizations, they represent communities that are very separate from each other, that their very nature gives us the rich diversity of our society, but at the same time causes real difficulties about how we bring them together. But I think we have to be very focused about that. We have to be very focused about this is not a professional discussion. This is a discussion of how the things you talk about in here today can be impacted on the people that are out there. And then the words that we use, the whole idea of language. Okay? We've got some very simple words in restorative justice and restorative practice, and we need to be more effective in the way we get those words into the communities we engage with. What I believe is that the most important thing for us to start with are the stories. The stories of the people, the stories of yourself, have got to be released. There is a real risk with professional people that we steal the stories of the people we work with. Okay? That is a very, very important thing to consider. To what degree do the processes you use, and are forced to use in some cases, do the exact opposite of what you want to do, which is give voice to people, but actually it steals the story. And I think we've also got to, and I thank Rick for this, Rick's in there somewhere, we finally met today, that stories are a real way of we reclaim our community. I think the city of Hull has refound its confidence because the entire city of culture has been about the people of Hull. We haven't brought in lots of artworks from outside and different places. It's been about finding the culture, finding the way in which we can talk to each other, overcoming narratives of presumption, that you can't do anything with those types of families, that you can't do anything with those people in that place. That's really, really become important to us, and we have to be able to do that. There are too many presumptions before we start which debar us from moving forward sometimes. And I think it's really important that we start to look at the possibilities of people as opposed to the risks that people employ. We've just done some work through the Restorative Justice Council last week in England on child sexual abuse and domestic violence, because so much good work's going on out there at the moment, but there's no sense of it, how we can pull that together so we can spread it across the country. But those narratives are around the sorts of paperwork we do. Okay, the sorts of paperwork we see when social workers work with families or teachers work with families, and it can be that sort of dynamic. And again, this is just really, it's the importance of this, if it's got any importance of this section of the conference, is just to ask some of these questions about what is it in the things you do that empower the stories to be released, and what are the things that hold those stories down. And I think it's really, really important that you have those honest discussions within your workplace and then in your outward-looking work with the families. Because many of the systems we use, to us, make perfect sense. Lots of lovely straight lines. I'd like to suggest that we're overwhelmed with the desire for things to be linear. To be looking through that restorative lens, I think that metaphor now needs moving away. It suggests a linear nature, a relationship that's backwards and forwards between the people we work with and between peoples going that way. I think that the image we need to start to think about is a kaleidoscopic one. I think the work you do is kaleidoscopic, and we have to find a way of making sense of that shifting picture that sits before our eyes. A linear model will not do it, because We think it looks perfectly fine, but at worst to some of our families, it can look like that and feel like that. At best sometimes, it can look like this. You know, that it's just, I don't get this. She's asking me to do that. He's asking me to do this. This piece of paper is asking me to do something else. And yet we struggle to engage them. I would also say, and this obviously doesn't apply to many of you maybe doing really engaged work, is that it's not that people aren't listening to us out there, the families. It's actually, genuinely, they're not interested because we haven't made the case well enough for our engagement with them in this way. And we have to make that case. We have to make that case drawing from them the stories that support us, drawing from the communities, the strength of the mentors that may exist in there. But we have to find a way of engaging them in such a way that the model we have at the moment, which is essentially a supply model, we supply services into troubled and difficult situations. And we have to change that to a demand model, where the families actually demand from us a restorative process when something's gone wrong. Communities demand a voice through restorative meetings in a community matter. Once that starts to happen, the supply model will change. So recently there's a big report in England around police forces' lack of use of restorative justice. And my argument at that conference was that won't change because police culture is too complex to change. Okay? What will change police culture will not be an inward decision, but it'll be that everybody in the community suddenly starts asking for this thing. When they start to do that, the system will change. We have to change that dynamic. And the example I would give is in the UK, I would be very surprised if I asked anybody in a room like this, put your hand up if you drink and drive, and put your hand up if you don't drive with a seatbelt on. But that wasn't always the case. 10, 15 years ago, those were not mandatory. People did not expect to have to do those things. There were laws, yes, but the reality is somebody gets in a car in the UK and they look across at the partner sitting next to them and they say, I can't go until you put your seatbelt on. And that change came about because of very, very good propaganda, very, very good engagement with the community. So in the end, it doesn't need policing because the community do that. The community demand for those laws to change is absolutely powerful. And the fastest turnaround in legislation in the UK for a long time, we've just seen about cell phones, using cell phones in cars. Okay? Without almost any problem at all, the law changed and people did it. Because the law changed because of the demand from the people, not because the police were asking for it necessarily. So that change in the dynamic is really, really important to us. And if we're looking at a process to do that, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that we are constantly working in partnerships with each other and across organisations and within organisations, but we're not good at looking at that partnership before it kicks into action. So the suggestion I'm making really is that there are 3 stages to changing your organisation, changing to the way you work in the locality you're working, which are around these 3 steps from Kay Harris, the peacemaking thinker. Okay? The first thing we have to do is be really clear about what it is we want the thing to look like. Okay? We have to make sure that we've got a sense of the vision of that thing, but not a vision that's so far away we can never reach it, but a real clear sense of what it is we want a restorative organisation to look like. How do we define that in language and behaviours? Okay. How would you define that around the values we are going to have to make sure our ends are not corrupted by the means we use to get them? To make sure the means we use meet the values that we've got. So it's really important. The means and ends situation is really quite a very delicate relationship. But we have to have clarity about what it is we want to achieve, but also the way we're going to do that. Because I've seen some statements in the UK where cities have said we are going to be a restorative city, but the process of use to get it has been far from restorative, and it's just disconnected itself from people's thinking. The second thing is to think carefully about what we need to build to help get on that journey. To think about the barriers that we may meet, to think about the areas where success can possibly happen, to think strategically about the approach we use in the direction we're going, and to make sure that the structures we build meet the philosophy of the means that we intend to use to get to those ends, to tie all of those things together. And also then, to really think about and imagine that journey, to almost have lived it as much as we possibly can, or at least, in 6-month chunks, to think about what it's going to be like when we get there, what processes we may need to get there, and to really have that dialogue, to think about how do we have the conversation within our organisations and across to the people that we work with. How do we share our vision for being restorative with the families that we're about to be restorative with? Because if we don't, it's just another thing that we do to them. And it may have the word within it, but that's not what it feels like to them when they've been used to this paternalistic model, and then this model, and here's another model coming along. How long will this last? So we have to think about that really, really carefully. And we have to think about being cautious and urgent about doing it. This can't wait forever, but we need to be cautious because we're driven by metrics, we're driven by data, the seductive desire to have quantitative data that justifies what you are all doing. We all understand the need for that because government and grantors understand that. But actually, the reality of the work you do is almost entirely qualitative. It takes a long time to make a change in the numbers that we need. And if it's qualitative, we have to therefore be much more aggressive or assertive about the statement that qualitative data around stories, around anecdotes, around the things that are happening in people's lives is a justifiable justification of this process. Because if we don't do that, we constantly leave the argument in a camp which is about numbers. Okay? If you count beans, you'll work out how many beans you've got. Okay? This is more complex than that, and so we have to think about that. And we also have to consider the people who pay us. They do want the data, and the argument around that data, as I've said, is around making them aware that it's more complex. You do important work in very complex environments, and the nature of the information we give to people has to reflect that complexity. It's a very difficult argument to win. Next week I've got a meeting with the Minister of State for Justice. The whole complexity of restorative justice in the UK will be discussed. We have 30 minutes. And at the end of that, I'm basically saying, show me the money. Show me the money, because we need the money. Because if you want this work to happen, show me the money. And I'm sure he'll be sensitive to our needs and not be late and give us 20 minutes instead of 30. But it is really, really important that we have to engage in that argument. But I think we have to be strong enough to say, for these reasons, the qualitative nature of the storytelling and the work we do is a valid justification for the work we do. The other important ingredient behind this is family. And we've got a large Pacifica and Maori groups in Hull, mainly because of rugby league. Lots of New Zealand and Pacifica players play in Hull and have done for a very, very long time. And the whole club is run in almost as a family in that way. They use circles, the players use circles, and they do actually restorative work without actually realising it. But the way we define family, I think, is really, really important, and we have to work with the complex nature of all the families we've got. But at the heart of all of this is the family. And without the family and the way we work with that family, we will not make change. So how do we empower family? And what I would say is family group conferencing is a way towards doing that. I think restorative processes are a way towards doing that, but they are processes. and we're usually doing them to the family at the point of a breakdown or some emergency. If we could just change it so that families are using these processes themselves around sibling squabbles, around all those things that happen in the home, that's when we suddenly make an impact. The impact is greater about us doing that than any impact we've got around data trends, recidivism, etc., etc. It will start in the family, and without the strength of the family, all our data is very, very vulnerable. And Nigel Richardson, who was the Director of Children's Services in Hull, and then in Leeds, a huge local authority in England, I think says this really well. The family is the single most important utility that we work with. And we don't give it enough status, we don't give it enough support. We can be very, very good at challenging it, but we need to think very carefully about the family and about the way we engage with that family and we make connections. Because those communities that those families live in will only become communities when the families can join together, when the professionals working with those families are joined together. And we have to move the agenda so that we make connection. It is all about connection. Today is about 380 variable connections that will happen. And the things that you take away as a result of that. The things you reject as a result of that. And all of these things will inform your practice. So how do we find the mechanisms to do that? And it's torturously slow because these families are damned ornery. They won't cooperate with the things we definitely know is best for them. And for goodness sakes, will they not just sit down and have a restorative meeting like everybody else? And it really is quite important, and it is a challenge. So we need to change that narrative. And in Leeds, there was a real sea change, a huge investment in small hubs that acknowledged that within each of those local geographical hubs, there were families. And the families went to schools, and the families used a dentist, and the families used a doctor's surgery, and the families used. And so the work went on in multi-agency ways, which attempted to join together all of those agencies. And in a second, you're going to do an exercise on your tables, which is a process we use at the beginning of any partnership building. You're doing the process for two reasons. One, you've sat for a very long time in a restorative. It's always bizarre, we have restorative conferences where somebody stands here where I am and you all listen. Okay? And there are things in your heads thinking, that man is an idiot. Or probably more likely, that was revelatory to me. I am now moved and transcended beyond anywhere I've possibly been. But you don't engage in a conversation, so we'll try and do a very small piece of work here, which is about the process we used to ignore the assumption that because we were suddenly told this table here are now working in partnership, that they know how to do it, that they understand each other's values and behaviours, that there's been a moment of reflection before going headlong into that grant fund that they've just got, of understanding who they are, where they're coming from, and where they'd like to go to. And that conversation it doesn't have to take very long, but it forms the basis from that point onwards of that future thinking. It will drive the means you use to get there, and it will drive as you reach the end, it will drive the next stage of moving that end forward. So this little exercise will be hopefully, we'll get some reflection from the floor, a sense of how do you understand the partners you're working with. The other thing that we need to understand is that this situation does need government, NGOs, charitable organisations, whoever it is working in the field, to reposition itself in terms of its relationship to the people we work with. Okay? We have to reposition ourselves with each other, and we have to reposition ourselves with the families that we're working with. We have to change the dynamic, which is too often a done-to dynamic, even though we're passionately determined we're going to work with. The structure just inhibits that sometimes. And that's a brave thing to do. It takes a hugely brave organisation to do that, but it's something you have to consider doing. And the reason why the kaleidoscope image sits with me is just this change in the way that we think about the way we work in partnership. If we sit at the heart of the work we do, the young people and families, and we understand each of these circles is a potential agency that works with them, as long as we've all got the young people and the families at the centre of our vision, as long as we all share a sense on how we're going to do things, why we're going to do things, when we're going to do things, it doesn't really matter at what point we work in partnership with different organisations, because at different points where those circles intersect, there's a space, there's a moment, and that moment will be transitional, it will be fleeting. It may be a year, it may be even less than that, depending on the opportunity you've got. But we have to be able to identify the moment when things overlap, when things intersect. And the only question should be is when that happens and those two agencies meet together, have they got family at the heart of what they're doing? And do they share a common understanding of the way they're going to do things and the direction they're going in? Because if they don't have that, we very quickly default back to, when things get tough, that punitive, paternalistic sort of paradigm. So starting to think in terms of a kaleidoscope of relationships and trying to fix them for the length of time it needs them fixing is the model that we've started to develop in some of the work I've been doing in some of the local authorities. Because we were just getting frustrated by the nature of thinking it was linear and that we would do this piece of work, this piece of work, and this piece of work. What we realised we had to be aware of was simultaneously there's lots of pieces of work happening, and that how do we capture that? And we needed to capture that through lots of mechanisms, not only the narrative stories, not only the data, but through lots of work with these communities around photography, around film. And at the end of this session, I'll just show you a short film. What I'd also say is that we have to accept ambiguity and we have to accept difference. And within this room, there will be 380 versions of restorative justice and restorative practice. There is not one script that binds them all. Okay, there is not one process that you can say definitively is the only process we can use. Because of the complex nature in which restorative justice is being used now in the families we're working with, it was not envisaged, really, some of the things that you are doing as practitioners and your colleagues are doing with this process. We had the way that New Zealand's flexed the original concept of family group conferencing to better fit its cultural situation. But we have to have a restorative practice and justice that recognises a culture, class, gender, sexuality, geography. And that, therefore, means there is not one model. There are sets of principles, there are sets of structures, but we have to be able to use those in a way which meets the needs of our families and not the needs of our process. And that's the direction a restorative organisation needs to move in. And then the concentration of power and influence in the hands of the professionals and the practitioners is in itself not necessarily a democratic way of doing things. It is unfortunately a shorthand way which is convenient for government and actually convenient for us sometimes. Because we don't have time sometimes to make decisions in the lives of these families that we think we need to make, because we haven't got the ability to fall back into other processes or feel strongly enough about those other processes. And until those families and those children and those young people believe we're not doing things to them but for them, we're releasing the stories, I don't believe we can move things forward as quickly as we would like to. And we have to find the mechanism for doing that. And it's messy. And almost finally now, we need to ask ourselves constantly, is the thing we're doing built around compassion, healing, understanding, honesty, and understanding of our needs and the needs of the people we're working with? Because that is the underlying question. And if that's the case, we should fight for the spread and the dissemination of restorative justice with real valiant hearts, because it's a courageous thing that people do. You know, and it's just not enough to change the clothes and to change the way we do things and to put a badge on it. What we have to do is change the way we feel about it. We need to leave this room after 2 days, and the other rooms you're in, with the ability to increase the chance of the people we work with to be seen and to be heard. And if we do that, we have dared courageously to do a thing which is very, very challenging. Thank you.